game of the day from round 6 of the Wijk aan Zee tournament was Fabiano Caruana against Magnus Carlsen, the number 2 in the world against the number 1 in the world. Now, going into this game, both players had 3 out of 5, but Caruana was coming off the back of a defeat against Wojciech, and Carlsen had defeated Aronian yesterday in a really beautiful game. Let's see how they got on in their games in 2014. They traded blows, wins and losses for both players, so this game was eagerly anticipated. Carlsen with the black pieces. And instead of going in for an open Sicilian, Caruana plays bishop b5, which has an excellent reputation actually. g6, okay, this is one of the standard ways to play. And to play bishop g7. And now bishop takes c6, so this changes the pawn structure, and we have a position where, although black has the 2 bishops, actually it's not easy to use those bishops, in particular the bishop on c8. You can see when white has placed pawns on light squares, this bishop doesn't have a good diagonal to go to, and particularly as this pawn is on c6, so even moves like b6 and bishop b7 obviously don't get anywhere. So from a positional point of view, it's quite a nice system for white, but it's also, well, black isn't under any immediate threat. So yeah, it's also a very popular system, I have to say, with both colours. So e5, now here's the first interesting moment in the game, and Caruana has quite a choice here. You can play queen d2 and potentially castle on the queen side. You can castle on the king side, or you could play knight takes e5. Now, Carlsen played e5 very, very quickly, so no doubt he would have been prepared for knight takes e5. But this leads to wild complications. But Caruana wasn't prepared to go in for that without looking at it carefully, so instead he played more conservatively. He played castle's king side. So that's a more cautious approach to the position. Now Carlsen castled as well. So instead of going for a kingside attack with kings on opposite sides, Caruana is playing for queenside expansion with b4. But now Carlsen counterattacks. Now, I mentioned earlier that this bishop on c8 doesn't have too much to do often in this opening. But here, now that white has castled on the king side, then this pawn on h3 is perhaps a little bit of a target. So I think Carlsen would have been pretty happy with the outcome of the opening. But it's still a very double-edged battle, b4. So with this, Caruana is hoping to break open the position on the queen side, and for example after this, playing pawn takes, I guess queen takes is also possible actually, but pawn takes opens up the file, and well, there's sometimes b5 and knight d5 as well, and that's unpleasant for black. But instead Carlsen played really aggressively. You could also play knight f4 here. That's also not a bad move, with the idea of bringing the knight to e6. Now that knight protects the pawn and perhaps threatens to come into d4. So that's quite a solid way of playing the position. But instead, Carlsen lashed out with f5, going all out for an attack on white's king. Now this damages or allows his queenside pawns to be damaged. First of all, he pushed this bishop away, and then recaptured here with the pawn. That means his queen is still well ready to perhaps contribute to an attack on the king side. But you can see in playing like this, Carlsen has allowed his pawns to be doubled and they're potentially weak. So let's see how Caruana exploited that. So first of all, the queen comes into play, attacking the pawn on c6. So rook c8 defends that, queen a5, and white is ready to play knight a4 to take the weak pawn on c5. But Carlsen counterattacks. It's not often that you see Carlsen play in this, well, I was going to say reckless manner. It's not exactly reckless, it's a strong counterattack, but you know, very often he plays with a sound pawn structure. But today he really was going for it. So Caruana continues with his plan, attacking this pawn. g4. Magnus has to let this pawn go, but he's opening lines on the king side, and you can see this bishop is really playing its part in the game. Caruana took the pawn. Now obviously Carlsen doesn't wish to exchange queens, so he keeps the queens on the board with queen f6. And now this is a big decision for white. How exactly are you going to deal with black's threats? Now one threat might be to transfer the queen to g6. Another is simply, certainly to take on f3 at the moment, followed by queen g6 check, and the king is in big trouble. Sometimes this knight can even throw itself on g3. So this is not easy. And I should also mention moves like king h8 and rook g8, bringing the rook into play. So Caruana faces a difficult choice here. I mean, one possibility is to move the rook on f1, allowing the pawns to be doubled, but perhaps looking to bring the king through to e2. But this is very tricky. Maybe king h8 to play rook g8, or perhaps rook f7. It's also interesting, preparing bishop f8. Or perhaps rook f7 straight away, followed by rook here. Still not easy to determine what's going on here. Caruana decided to avoid any problems there and instead played knight h2. But Carlsen has a few ways to continue the attack. One possibility is queen g5. Very simple. Threatening to play bishop h3. It's a very dangerous move. Carlsen played f3, also extremely dangerous. Just breaking through to the king. So g3 would be, well, really horrible move. Well, it's quite possible that knight g3 wins immediately, but there's also bishop h3. I think black is just winning that position. So, knight takes bishop. Attacking the queen. The queen has to move. And, although white is a piece up, everything is lined up here. If the knight comes back to e3, then knight f4 is deadly. I mean, apart from the threats to g2, there's also knight e2 check and a mate on the h-file. Queen e7, it's the only defence. Basically, white is bringing the queen back to g5 to trade queens. Now, before taking the knight, Carlsen damages the pawns here, damages white's king position, and now takes the knight off. Queen g5 is the only move. So if the queen retreats, then queen takes knight. Now Carlsen tried queen e2, threatening the pawn here, and there's only one decent move, and that's queen e3, and the queen came back. And once again queen g5. So Carlsen knows he has a draw if he wants it. So here he thought for 5 minutes or so, weighing up his chances, and thought, well, I'm not risking anything by going in for this endgame. And then knight f4. Tricky position. So the knight holds the pawn on g2 and threatens knight h3 check. At first I thought bishop h4 might be a good move, putting the bishop back here, but c5 is quite strong, threatening to swing this rook over, perhaps to h6. King h2 might be a better move, perhaps preparing, well, rook b7 and perhaps rook g1, and only then taking this pawn. Perhaps white can hold that position. But instead, Caruana, after 7 minutes thought, made a terrible error of judgment. He exchanged off Now, if this pawn is allowed to f3, then that's a disaster. So king takes pawn f3 check. And here, well, king h3, as we'll see, is the best move. And then black takes the exchange, and there's no doubt in my mind that black is better here. Whether black can win is another matter, but black is better. Instead, Caruana played king f1 very quickly. Now, clearly he was thinking that in this endgame, an exchange down, once the king reaches e3, the king is completely secure. White has a very compact position, perhaps can advance the centre pawns, and probably has pretty decent drawing chances. But he had forgotten that, in fact, it's not necessary to take the rook, and rook f4 came as an absolute shocker to him. The point is, black is threatening to deliver checkmate on the back rank, and if the king tries to run away, then bishop h6 will keep the king locked in, and that's why Carlsen didn't take the rook in the corner. So that's my phone. I'm going to turn that off. That's rather unfortunate. And I really don't want to start that recording again, so I'm going to turn that off. Thank you. I'm going to be disqualified under FIDE regulations. So c3, blocking. Rook d8. So this is going to keep the king locked in. d4. And now there's actually a spectacular way to win. Bishop takes d4 will actually force mate after this. For example, king g1 and king h8. Or king e1 and rook takes d4 and rook h1 mate. But okay, the way Carlsen selected is actually very simple. This also keeps the king in a terrible box. So rook takes pawn check. Now he's cleaning up, and this is a great move that comes next. He wants to play rook e2, but white can probably defend for a little bit at least with rook b2. So instead he plays c5, a fantastic idea. So if knight takes c5, then rook e2, you can see white can't defend on the second rank, and that is fatal. Really nice finesse with c5. Then came king c2, and now, well, basically black is just taking all these pawns, and white's king is still in trouble here actually. For example, c takes, then, well, it's going to be mate, well, or something nasty is going to happen here very soon. Caruana tried to block out the rooks with c4, but Carlsen is just cleaning up here. After this move, Caruana resigned. He's 2 pawns down. His king is still in desperate trouble after rook e3, and both these pawns are really too strong. It's all over. For example, rook f1, check, d3, and so on. It really is all over. So a convincing victory by Magnus Carlsen. That's 3 in a row now, and very tough on Caruana. So Carlsen is now on 4 points. He's certainly back in the race for first place. Wesley So is also on 4 points. He defeated Jabava today very well. Wojciech had a solid draw, so they're on 4 points. But Ivanchuk is still out on his own with 4.5. So 6 rounds played, and well, still 7 to go. We're not even halfway through the tournament. Thanks for watching.